something kind of strange is happening to combo decks in eternal formats of Magic the Gathering. It started with Reanimator before Entomb was banned, then we saw it in Oops All Spells, and then finally we're seeing it now with Vroomsday. And the thing that all these decks have in common is that they're a combo deck with another strategy shoved inside of them.
First time.
With Reanimator, we see them able to execute a tempo plan as well as the Reanimator combo. We see Oops All Spells able to juke to Goblin Charbelcher in their sideboard. And with Vroomsday, we see the deck able to not only pull off sort of the Doomsday combo, but also Fantasticar. So let's discuss why this is happening, the role sideboards have to play in this, and also how we can design our own games to prevent this sort of thing from happening.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so first, to kind of understand what's going on with this problem, we need to explore what a combo deck is in depth. And the way I tend to define combo decks is that they are the extreme end of the economy side of the strategy circle. For those who don't know, we talk about strategy circle a lot on this channel. It consists of rush, economy, and defense. And this is the most general way you can spend your resources in a resource management game, where if you're spending your resources to win the game now, that's what the rush category is. If you're investing your resources to win the game later, that's the economy side of the strategy circle. And defense is investing your resources to stop your opponent from winning. And this is not a replacement for the sort of aggro control combo mid-range archetypes that we see in card games often. This is a more zoomed out view of how you spend your resources. And so when we're talking about combo, I'm seeing it as the most extreme end of the economy side of the scale. The reason why is because often combo cards don't really do anything on their own, right? They're a piece that you invest in to then later get the payoff of winning the game when you get the other side of the combo. So let's peel back the layers a bit before we get to combos themselves, right? What is economy? Economy is a card that would allow you to invest your resources in getting more cards or more mana. It could also be things that improve the card quality of what's in your hand. Those are often the draw spells like Brainstorm and Ponder. It could be Rampant Growth, which is investing mana to get you more mana. Or it could be something like Phyrexian Arena that will continue to provide you card advantage each turn of the game, each turn as the game goes on. The next step up the rung in economy strategies would be something that develops a card advantage or mana advantage engine, where we're putting multiple cards into play with their synergies put together. They're giving us a greater effect. And these would be things like the Urzatron lands, Urza's Power Plant, Mine, and Tower. This could also be something like Astral Slide and Life from the Loam and the Cycling lands. Or it could be something like Goryo's Vengeance, Greater Good, and the Kamigawa Dragons. And so as we move up the scale, we're seeing that the payoff that you get from combining these cards strengthens and moves closer to just winning you the game outright. When you have an economy engine going, you haven't necessarily won the game yet. Your advantage is incrementally improving over your opponent while that engine is running. So then finally, when we get all the way up to the combo potential of economy, we can kind of see that logically, if an economy engine is about combining two cards to ultimately win the game, why not combine two cards to win the game right then? And so oftentimes combo decks will play a lot of cards that help you get to the point where you can put those two cards in play together, and then the game is over. These are things like mana ramp or card draw or tutor spells, anything that can sort of get you closer to the ability to combine those two cards in play. This would be things like Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, or Demonic Consultation, Deceiver Exarch and Splinter Twin with the Splinter Twin combo, or Triskelion and Heliod. Let's take a look at a few different ways that combo manifests, and so we can see what helps make a healthy combo play pattern versus one that I think is less desirable. So first, let's start with Elf Ball. And Elf Ball is more of like an accumulation type of combo strategy. It's really heavily, it's more heavily in the engine side of things, right? It's right on that line, I think, between an engine economy strategy or a combo deck where your engine can be efficient enough that you're gaining enough mana and drawing enough cards that you ultimately can kind of win the game in one turn, but it's kind of a non-deterministic combo. One of the reasons why I think Elf Ball is one of the best combo decks, the best designed combo decks in Magic, is that most of this happens on the board, and it usually happens over the course of a few turns. So there's a lot of interaction points for your opponent and a lot of telegraphing before you ultimately get to that win condition. My experience playing against Elf Ball was mostly in the standard format. So the combo I remember playing distinctly would be Nettle Sentinel and Heritage Druid, and then another elf, sometimes like Elvish Archdruid or something. So then you would use this to generate a lot of mana, and then put a Regal Force into play, which draws a number of cards equal to the number of green creatures that you have. And you would continue this pattern, filling up a board full of elves, and ultimately you would play a Craterhoof Behemoth to win the game. This isn't like a 2-card combo that necessarily just wins the game outright, but you can see that sort of spectrum moving from engine into combo territory as your ability to sort of do all of this in one turn becomes possible. But it requires a lot of cards, and there's a lot of interaction points. And it involves creatures, and creatures are another... creatures have a lot more interaction knobs, right? You could use Swords to Plowshares, you could counterspell them, you can bounce them. There's a whole lot of additional things that you can do to interact with these creatures before the deck would ultimately win the game. And then sort of next up the chain, which I think is like an okay combo to have in a game, is something like Splinter Twin. And I would also say that Splinter Twin in more Eternal formats rather than in something like the standard format. Splinter Twin as a combo deck requires only 2 cards, but those 2 cards do cost quite a bit of mana and often involve some kind of a creature again, right? So there are quite a few more interaction knobs here than what there would be otherwise. The big difference here between Elves and Splinter Twin is that Splinter Twin you can assemble in your hand with hidden information. So your opponent is going to have to read context clues in order to understand how close you are to executing that combo. And ultimately, they still need to make sure they have some kind of interaction or can beat you before you can pull the combo off. And I think the most extreme end, and I think what is the worst kind of combo deck, is one that requires a single card and has very few interaction points and can happen very quickly. It doesn't require all that much mana. And we see this in something like Oops All Spells. If you resolved Undercity Informer or Balustrade Spy, the game is effectively over. And not only that, we kind of get into the problem that we're discussing today, which is that when the cost to including a combo in your deck becomes small enough, it opens the door to include more combos. Economy strategies start to become combo decks, and instead of this sort of engine accumulation building that happens over time, it instead becomes I put 2 cards together and I win the game. Economy strategies start to act a lot more like rush strategies, which is I am theoretically investing my resources in winning the game later, but now I can invest my resources to win the game now. And I think this has a whole lot of poor implications for maintaining the different strategies that you could use to combat these decks. And at its most extreme, we see gameplay that looks quite a bit like the game Exploding Kittens, which is where you have an Exploding Kitten card, and if you draw it, you have to have a Diffuse card. If you don't have the Diffuse card, you lose the game. And so the game narrows its focus down to a single subgame of, I'm going to present a win attempt, and if you have the answer, then we get to keep playing the game. But if you don't have the answer, I win the game. When these cards become not only the package becomes smaller, where you only need 2 cards to win the game, or a single card in the case of Oops All Spells, it also matters how efficient you were able to cast those spells. And in context, that might mean that these cards cost less mana, but it also could mean that the format includes powerful tools to get you to that effect sooner, and you might not have to invest as many resources in even getting to that ultimate conclusion. And once you start down this road with a game, there tends to become an arms race between these combo decks and interaction. And if we, looking back to the strategy circle, if economy starts to act more like rush, now the thing that would normally beat economy, which would be rush, starts to become less of an efficient way to stop what they're doing. You're not able to invest in winning the game now while your opponent is investing to win the game later so that you can beat them before they get those payoffs. And so combo can kind of overtake the rush side of the circle. And then suddenly we just have a dual system instead of a tri system where defense and economy / rush are kind of the only things going on. And that's when we get that sort of Exploding Kittens dynamic. If combos are more efficient, then we need more efficient interaction in order to stop them from being able to do their thing. And so interaction theoretically should have to be relatively specific, which would mean that as a metagame evolves, control decks need to make difficult decisions about which interactive spells they're going to use in order to counter the meta so that they're not winning against rush strategies 100% of the time. Sometimes they're not going to have the right interaction. When it comes down to a single sub-game of do you have the interaction piece you need or you lose the game, that interaction needs to be more generic so that when you draw it, you can make it so you actually have a game to play. And so we see this sort of incremental increase in not only efficiency of interaction, but also in how generic of problems that it solves. You'd have something like Celestial Purge, which only affects the red and black creatures, or you'd have something like Swords to Plowshares, which can exile any creature. Not only does it not put it in the graveyard, it's now gone from the game and it costs 1 mana. And then finally, if a combo deck isn't really even using creatures as their interaction points, you might need something like Force of Will so that you can ensure that if a combo can be pulled off on turn 1 of the game, a player would have some way to interact with that spell. As these interaction pieces get more powerful and generic, they start to cut both ways because they start to be able to interact with other interaction pieces. And so if you're not careful, you end up in the situation where the combo decks can play interaction pieces that can stop their opponent from stopping them. And suddenly, instead of needing one piece of interaction to stop a combo, you need multiple. And we've talked about it before, but there's one specific piece of interaction that I think is particularly bad in this category, and that's Pact of Negation, because it is effectively a counterspell for free as long as you win the game that turn. And that, to me, is one of the best pieces of interaction for a combo deck that is trying to stop their opponent from stopping them and ultimately win the game. The losing side of the equation is the person that has to spend resources to stop their opponent so that the game can continue, not so that they can win the game. So let's talk for a minute about sideboards and how the role that they're playing in this scenario. And I see sideboards as being quite similar to how we're seeing interaction evolve. Sideboards are theoretically a tool for you to not have to pollute your deck with things that are only good in very specific matchups, right? Where theoretically more aggressive decks are sort of favored game 1, and so reactive decks would have different tools in their sideboard that they could swap out for certain cards in their main deck to give them a better advantage to win games 2 and 3. The way that sideboards are kind of cutting both ways, if combo packages are small enough or are synergistic enough with each other, you can instead hide that secondary combo in your sideboard and juke to that game plan in games 2 and 3. It sort of even moves the sub-game that matters to whether or not you can call the shot of what your opponent is going to juke to. And I've heard Bosch and Roll kind of describe this as a shell game, where this is referencing the game where you have like you have like 3 shells and then you put a ball under one of them and then you're moving them around and then you try to guess which shell holds the ball. And the game theoretically could be over before the game has even started to be played if you called incorrectly. And your opponent, let's say with Oops All Spells, is Oops All Spells game 1, and then has juked to Goblin Charbelcher in game 2, but you brought in things like Rest in Peace and Leyline of the Void, thinking that would save you. But instead, now they're just focused on getting Goblin Charbelcher in play. And so a lot of pressure is being put on defensive strategies in order to sort of call the shot effectively and making sure that they keep their deck filled with cards that extend the game rather than actually win them the game. And so you end up in a situation where so much pressure is being put on the game that you're almost better off just joining forces of the combo players and saying like, all right, well, I'm just going to hope I win the coin flip and theoretically win the game. Let's touch on cEDH for just a minute, because cEDH has this as its escalation cycle. Like, this is just how the format works. Every deck in the format plays multiple combos, usually Thassa's Oracle, Demonic Consultation, and Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, as well as a host of others, Infinite Mana, whatever. So part of the necessity of playing multiple combos in cEDH comes from the fact that you have a 100-card singleton deck. And so instead of being able to just play multiple copies of the same combo, you end up playing more combos, right? Usually ones that might have some kind of overlap with each other, similar to how Vroomsday works with Fantastic Car. And the other thing that is sort of interesting about cEDH, though, is that you're fighting through 3 other players' worth of interaction. I think this sort of gets us closer. This sort of gets us into what some of the solutions to this are, which I think cEDH has kind of stumbled into one, but I don't think it's a particularly good one. But it's that if you have more opponents, you're going to have to fight through more interaction in order to actually win the game. The odds of your opponent having the diffuse card, right, similar to that exploding kittens reference, the odds of one of your opponents having a diffuse card is quite higher. And the other thing that we're seeing is that Magic has started off on this interaction arms race. And one of the ways we're seeing this is with silence effects instead of counter spells. So things that sort of like stop your opponents from just being able to play spells altogether. It's sort of like a blanket counter spell. Once I've played this, no other spells may be played. But again, these cut both ways. And so the major play pattern that we see in cEDH is that in order to stop and fight through 3 opponents worth of interaction, you're going to play a card that just makes it so your opponents can't play spells or that yours can't be countered or whatever it is, right? We're starting to see quite a few more of these being printed. Voice of Victory, Hexing Squelcher. Now in the Hobbit set, we have Bilbo's Gambit. It's tough though, because in some ways you need cEDH to have these tools so that the game can end, right? If after the 11-hour game, cEDH kind of made some changes to the rules so that there are time limits in elimination rounds, which has a whole host of other problems that we're not going to get into today. But needless to say, it would be ideal if games could end through the game systems themselves. And so these tools are important, but they sort of, again, create this weird one-dimensional gameplay, which is, do I have the ability to shut off my opponent's diffuse cards? And now I've sort of one-upped this idea of, I'm going to present the thing that wins the game. Do any of my opponents have the diffuse card? Do I have the card that defuses the diffuse cards? And you see, we just sort of stack these ideas on top of each other. And ultimately, it just comes down to who has the correct cards in hand in that very moment. Do you have the exact cards you need? And so, yeah, ultimately, one solution to this problem is to escalate interaction. If we're instead designing our systems from the ground up, though, we can start to look for systemic ways that we can curb these problems. The first one is rotation, obviously, is that inevitably you will print cards that will combo together and do broken things. And one of the best ways historically to remove these things was just to remove these things from the game, right? You could ban them or you could rotate them out of the format. But it would be nice if we could, if we're redesigning a system from the ground up, we could look for ways instead to curb it within the systems. And another way that this could be handled is to sort of avoid combo in your game. You can kind of create stopgaps within your game system to ensure that a certain number of subgames will be played. This is something that we're starting to see a lot more often in modern games. Riftbound has this, where you can only score so many points each turn, you need to score those points to win the game by claiming the battlefield. Or something in Sorcery where you have Death's Door, which means that once your avatar is taken to 0 life, you still have to be hit one more time before the game is over. And these don't necessarily entirely eliminate combo as an archetype, right? So if we're looking at combo as the most extreme of the economy side of the scale, we'd still be able to invest in those sort of economy engines in those games, but we can't get the finale payoff immediately, right? It has to take a certain number of turns in which our opponent would have the ability to respond to what we're doing. In some ways, though, these play patterns aren't going to feel the same as these sort of traditional style combo decks where you can just kind of win out of nowhere, which I do think is a bit more exciting. But I do wonder if the payoff is worth it, right? If you're embracing that style of play, your game, without proper pruning of the meta, will end up in this sort of arms race where we get back to that sort of exploding kittens type gameplay. I think that the ultimate best solution would be able to figure out a way to make sure that the metagame is going to turn over and that these problems can be self-correcting. Like I was saying earlier, I think the best way to do that would be to design combo decks with the ability for lots of different interaction points so that reactive decks can have a lot of different ways to answer these combo decks for things that are going on that also overlap with other decks that they might be weak to. But ultimately, over time, if you're not rotating, and if you don't have a rotating format, you're going to accumulate this type of pressure on the game where you're winning the game outright through cards just in hand that are difficult to interact with. Eventually, that stuff just kind of happens. I think the best solution and why we're seeing it in many games now is just to make it so a combo strategy can't just win all in one turn. But I think for a lot of combo players, that does feel a bit less satisfying. But yeah, let me know in the comments what you think. Does this gameplay feel one-dimensional to you? Is there something more deep here that I'm missing about this gameplay? I'm curious to know because the game I'm working on myself has chosen the path of limiting combo interactions in the game. If you're looking to join a community of like-minded game designers, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!